Did you know that a pound of kitchen grease could help make explosives? Or that old lipstick tubes were collected for their brass casings? The Second World War wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in kitchens, garages, and schoolyards across the world. Governments asked their citizens for everything, and people responded. They turned in things you would never imagine. This wasn't just about patriotism. It was a matter of survival. The war machine had an insatiable appetite for raw materials. Every old tire, every tin can, every scrap of paper was a resource that could be turned into a weapon or a piece of equipment. It was a global effort of recycling on a scale never seen before or since. But how did they convince millions of people to give up their personal belongings? What was the real impact of a single family's pot and pan donation? And what secrets about this massive effort are still buried in the past? Number 19, could a strand of hair change the course of a bombing run? It sounds strange, but people gave up their hair not for, wigs or for charity in the way we think of it today. They gave it up for a very specific, highly technical purpose. The hair was needed for precision instruments of war. The most famous example was the Norden bombsight. This was a mechanical computer, a marvel of its time, used in American bombers. It was designed to allow a bombardier to drop bombs with incredible accuracy from high altitudes. Inside this complex device were crosshairs. Just like the crosshairs on a rifle scope, these needed to be extremely fine, strong, and stable across a wide range of temperatures and humidity. Spider silk was often the preferred material for such things, but it was delicate and difficult to source in the quantities needed. So they turned to human hair, specifically blonde hair, and even more specifically, blonde hair from a particular demographic. The specifications were strict. The hair had to be from a young woman who had never treated it with chemicals or heat. It needed to be naturally blonde, long, and healthy. The idea was that this type of hair was finer and stronger. The government, through contractors like the Sperry Gyroscope Company, put out calls for it. Women would see advertisements and donate their long locks. The collected hair was then carefully inspected. If it met the criteria, it was used. A single strand would be stretched across the viewing mechanism of the bomb site. This single hair could be the difference between a bomb hitting its target or missing by hundreds of feet. The man behind the bomb site, Carl Norden, was a Dutch engineer who had immigrated to the United States. He spent decades perfecting his device, which was considered a top military secret. The precision it offered was a key part of American air power strategy. The reliance on something as simple and organic as a strand of human hair inside such a high-tech piece of equipment is a strange contrast. It shows how even the most advanced technology of the era still depended on basic natural materials. The campaign to collect hair wasn't as widespread as the drives for scrap metal or rubber. It was more targeted, more specific. But for the women who donated, it was a deeply personal contribution. They were giving a part of themselves, quite literally, to the war effort. This wasn't just an old pot or pan. It was something that had grown with them for years. But the story is not as simple as it seems. While the call for blonde hair is a well-known anecdote of the war, its actual prevalence is debated by historians. Some sources suggest that while human hair was tested and used, other materials like fine tungsten wire or etched glass were often more reliable and became the standard. The campaign for hair might have been as much about morale and propaganda as it was about a genuine large-scale need. It made people feel involved in the most secret and advanced parts of the war. It connected a young woman in the American Midwest directly to a bombardier flying miles above enemy territory. The truth of its impact is likely a mix of both genuine need and powerful symbolism. What do we still not know? We don't know exactly how many Norden bomb sites were ultimately fitted with human hair crosshairs versus other materials. Was it a small, early war batch, or was it a continuous practice? We also don't know the exact process for selecting and compensating the donors, if they were compensated at all. Were there specific regions of the country targeted for these donations based on population genetics? And most importantly, how many of the women who donated their hair were ever told the true secret purpose for which it was used? Number 18, did your grandmother's soup bones end up in a shell? Every family that cooked a roast or made soup had bones left over. Normally they were thrown out. But during the war, they became a critical resource. The government wanted them. They wanted every last scrap. Posters went up everywhere with slogans like "Bones for Bombs." It was a stark message. It connected the most domestic of activities, cooking a family meal, with the industrial reality of warfare. People were instructed to boil the bones clean, remove any bits of meat, and then let them dry. Once dry, they were to be taken to a local collection depot, often run by a butcher or a local committee. The reason was chemistry. Animal bones are rich in minerals, fats, and collagen. When processed through rendering, they produce a number of useful materials. The most important of these for the war effort was glycerin. Glycerin is a key ingredient in making nitroglycerin, which is the explosive component in dynamite and cordite, a type of smokeless propellant used in bullets and artillery shells. The fats rendered from the bones could be turned into glycerin. It was a simple, if grisly, equation. The more bones collected, the more explosives could be manufactured. A 1943 report from the British Ministry of Supply stated that the bones from an average week's household waste could produce enough glycerin for a small shell. Beyond glycerin, the bones had other uses. The collagen was used to make strong glues. These weren't just for putting paper together. Animal-based adhesives were vital in manufacturing, particularly for woodworking. They were used in the construction of wooden aircraft like the British Mosquito bomber, which was nicknamed the Wooden Wonder. The glues had to be incredibly strong to hold the aircraft together under the stresses of flight and combat. The minerals from the bones, once everything else was extracted, were ground down to make fertilizer. This was also crucial. With many farm workers serving in the military and supply chains disrupted, maximizing crop yields was a matter of national security. The fertilizer helped feed both the population at home and the troops abroad. The collection process was a massive logistical undertaking. In Britain, it was managed by the Ministry of Supply. In the United States, the War Production Board oversaw similar efforts. Local councils set up collection bins. Boy Scouts and other volunteer groups often went door to door to pick up the collected bones. The whole process was framed as a patriotic duty. Not saving your bones was seen as wasteful and unhelpful. The propaganda was powerful, often showing soldiers and munitions next to a picture of a smiling housewife holding a bag of bones. It created a direct link between the home front and the front lines. The scale was immense. Records from the United Kingdom show that tens of thousands of tons of bones were collected from households over the course of the war. But how effective was it really? While household bone collection contributed, the vast majority of glycerin and other bone-derived products came from industrial sources like slaughterhouses and meat processing plants. These sources were far more efficient to process. Some historians, like Lucy Worsley in her book If Walls Could Talk, suggest that the household collection campaigns were as much about morale and public engagement as they were about raw material. It gave everyone, especially women at home, a tangible way to contribute every single day. It was a constant reminder that the war was a total effort and no contribution was too small. So what mysteries remain? We don't have precise figures on what percentage of the total glycerin supply came from household collections versus industrial sources. Was it 1%, 5%, or more? How did the quality of glycerin from household bones compare to industrial sources? And did this affect its use in munitions? We also don't know the full story of the black market for these materials. Were there illicit sales of bones or rendered fat that bypassed the official channels? And finally, what was the psychological toll of constantly handling and thinking about bones, a symbol of death, as part of a daily routine to support the war? Number 17, could a frying pan shorten the war? After cooking bacon or frying meat, what do you do with the leftover grease? Most people today would let it cool and throw it away. During the war, that grease was liquid gold. It was a strategic material, and saving it was a critical patriotic duty for millions of households. The American Fat Salvage Committee was formed in the United States, and similar bodies existed in other allied nations. Their message was simple and direct: save waste fats for explosives. Just like with bones, the key ingredient was glycerin. A pound of waste kitchen fat could be rendered to produce enough glycerin for a significant amount of gunpowder. The process for the public was straightforward. After cooking, you were supposed to pour the warm liquid fat into a clean metal can. You'd keep collecting it until the can was full. Then, You would take the can to your local butcher. The butcher would pay you for it, usually a few cents per pound, and give you meat ration points in return. This created a powerful incentive. The butcher would then sell the collected fat to a renderer who would process it and sell the resulting materials to the government for war production. This created a complete supply chain that started in the family kitchen and ended on the battlefield. The campaign was heavily promoted. Disney even produced an animated short in 1942 called Out of the Frying Pan into the Firing Line, starring Minnie Mouse and Pluto. In it, Pluto is tempted to steal a can of bacon grease, but Minnie explains that it's needed for the war effort. The short film explains how the glycerin from the fat is used to make shells. It was a simple, effective piece of propaganda aimed at the entire family. Radio programs, women's magazines, and newspapers constantly reminded people of the importance of saving their fat. The message was clear: wasting fat was helping the enemy. The numbers involved were staggering. The American Fat Salvage Committee set ambitious goals, aiming to collect hundreds of millions of pounds of waste fat each year. While they didn't always meet these targets, the amount collected was still immense. In 1943 alone, American households salvaged over 150 million pounds of waste cooking fat. This was a massive decentralized national effort relying on the daily habits of millions of individuals. It fundamentally changed the way people thought about waste. What was once garbage was now a weapon. This campaign was particularly targeted at women who managed the household kitchens. It empowered them and gave them a central role in the war effort. They, were not just passive supporters, they were active participants in the logistics of war. The government understood this. A 1944 campaign advertisement read, "Hughes Wives of America, that skillet of bacon grease you hold in your hand as a weapon of war." This kind of language was common. It militarized the domestic space and turned everyday chores into acts of patriotism. The campaign also had a secondary benefit. By encouraging the reuse of fat, it helped stretch the ration supply of cooking oils and fats, which were in short supply. But there are still things we don't fully understand about this massive effort. How much of the collected fat was actually usable? Surely some of it was contaminated or went rancid before it could be processed. What were the loss rates in the supply chain? We also have limited information on the social dynamics of the collection. Were there fat-shaming incidents where people who didn't save their grease were ostracized by their neighbors? How did the system of paying for fat and awarding ration points vary from city to city, and was it susceptible to corruption? And perhaps the most intriguing question, could a detailed analysis of the collected fats from different regions have provided the government with data on the dietary habits and health of the American population during the war? Number 16, did a pair of stockings become a lifeline? Before the war, nylon was a miracle. Introduced by DuPont at the 1939 New York World's Fair, it was a synthetic fiber that was strong, light, and beautiful. Nylon stockings were an instant sensation. They were more durable and elegant than silk stockings. Women across America stood in long lines to buy them. They were a symbol of modern fashion and affordable luxury. But when the war began, nylon's properties, strength, lightness, and resistance to mildew made it far more valuable for military applications than for fashion. The government quickly requisitioned all nylon production for the war effort. Suddenly, the production of nylon stockings for the public ceased. They became a rare and precious commodity. But the story didn't end there. The government didn't just want new nylon, it wanted the old stockings too. Women were asked to donate their used, torn, and worn-out nylon stockings. Collection bins were set up in department stores and community centers. It was another campaign that asked for a personal sacrifice. For many women, their stockings were one of their few remaining luxuries, a small connection to a time of peace and normalcy. And giving them up was a tangible act of support. The collected stockings were recycled, they were melted down, and the nylon polymer was reprocessed. This reclaimed nylon was then used to make a variety of military items. The most well-known use was for parachutes. A single parachute required a significant amount of fabric, and nylon was the ideal material. It replaced silk, which had become nearly impossible to obtain after supply lines from Asia were cut. Tens of Thousands of airmen and paratroopers relied on these nylon parachutes for their survival. The connection was direct and powerful. A pair of stockings from a woman in Ohio could save the life of a pilot bailing out of his plane over Europe. But parachutes weren't the only use. The strong nylon fibers were also used to make glider tow ropes. These ropes had to be incredibly strong to pull heavy, troop-filled gliders into the air. Nylon was also used for aircraft tire cords, reinforcing the rubber and making the tires more durable for rough landings. It was woven into flak jackets to help protect aircrews from shrapnel. It was even used for shoelaces and jungle boots, as it was resistant to the rot and mildew that destroyed cotton laces in damp environments. The versatility of the material was astounding. These stocking drives became a cultural phenomenon. They were often organized by local women's groups. The imagery was potent, piles of delicate feminine stockings being collected to create rugged, life-saving military equipment. It highlighted the profound transformation of the economy and society. Everything, even fashion, was now in service of the war. After the war ended and nylon production returned to civilian use, the announcement that stockings would be available again led to the nylon riots in some cities, as huge crowds of women lined up, desperate to buy them after years of going without. This reaction shows just how much the sacrifice had meant to them. Despite the fame of the stocking drives, there are still gaps in our knowledge. What was the actual efficiency of the recycling process? How much usable nylon polymer could be reclaimed from a pound of old stockings compared to producing new nylon? We don't have precise numbers on how many parachutes or other items were made specifically from recycled nylon versus new production. Was the drive more important for the material it provided or for the message of shared sacrifice it sent? And what happened to the vast quantities of silk stockings that were made obsolete by nylon? Were there similar, less publicized drives to collect and repurpose silk as well? Number 15. Could a flat tire help win a war at sea? America ran on rubber. Cars, trucks, and buses all needed tires. But in 1942, the nation faced a catastrophic rubber shortage. Over 90% of the world's natural rubber supply came from plantations in Southeast Asia. With the expansion of the conflict in the Pacific, this supply was completely cut off. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a strategic crisis. Rubber was essential for the military. Not just for the tires on jeeps and trucks, but for battleships which used rubber for insulation, hoses, and gaskets. A single battleship contained tens of thousands of pounds of it. It was used in airplanes for fuel tanks and tires. It was used in gas masks and life rafts. Without rubber, the Allied war machine would grind to a halt. In response, the government launched one of the largest and most urgent recycling campaigns of the war, the Great American Scrap Rubber Drive. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself went on the radio in June 1942 to address the nation. He asked every citizen to search their homes, garages, and barns for any and all items made of rubber. The slogan was, "Get in the scrap." People were asked to donate old tires, raincoats, galoshes, garden hoses, hot water bottles, and rubber floor mats. Nothing was too small. The response was overwhelming. The drive was framed as a patriotic treasure hunt. The communities held parades and rallies. Gas stations became official collection depots, weighing the rubber and giving donors a receipt. The goal set by the government was to collect 400,000 tons of scrap rubber. In just a few weeks, the American people collected over 450,000 tons. It was a stunning success. Piles of scrap rubber grew into small mountains in towns and cities across the country. These rubber mountains were a visible symbol of the nation's collective will. The collected rubber was sent to processing plants where it was reclaimed. The process involved shredding the rubber and then using heat and chemicals to break it down so it could be reformed into new products. This reclaimed rubber wasn't as good as new rubber, but it could be used for many essential items like retreading tires or making seals and gaskets. It was a crucial stopgap measure. It bought the country time. While the scrap drives were happening, the government was also engaged in a frantic effort to create a synthetic rubber industry from scratch. Scientists like Waldo Semon at B.F. Goodrich had been working on synthetic rubber for years, but now their research was given top priority. The government funded the construction of dozens of new factories to produce synthetic rubber on a massive scale. By 1944, the American synthetic rubber industry was producing more rubber than the entire world's natural rubber production had been before the war. It was one of the greatest technological and industrial achievements of the era. The scrap rubber drive of 1942 was the bridge that got the country from the crisis of the shortage to the triumph of synthetic production. It kept the military supplied during that critical period. The drive also had a lasting impact on civilian life. A national speed limit of 35 miles per hour was imposed to conserve tires. Gasoline was rationed in part to reduce driving and save rubber. The Victory Speed Limit, as it was called, changed the American landscape. There are still many unanswered questions about this pivotal campaign. How much of the collected 450,000 tons was actually of a quality that could be reclaimed? Were there significant logistical bottlenecks in transporting and processing such a massive sudden influx of material? We also don't know the full story of the resistance to the drive. Were there individuals or businesses that hoarded rubber, speculating on its price? And what was the environmental impact of the reclaiming process, which involved harsh chemicals and high energy consumption at a time when environmental concerns were virtually non-existent? Number 14, could a child's toy wagon be melted down for a tank? Metal was the skeleton of the war machine. Steel for ships, aluminum for planes, brass for shell casings. The demand was nearly infinite. The industrial capacity of the United States was a decisive factor in the war, but the factories needed a constant supply of raw materials. To meet this demand, the government's War Production Board launched a nationwide scrap metal drive in the fall of 1942. It was perhaps the most iconic of all the home front campaigns. The goal was to collect millions of tons of scrap iron and steel from every corner of the country. The call went out to everyone. People were asked to scour their homes and communities for any unused or unwanted metal. The list was endless: old pots and pans, broken radiators, old farm equipment, bed frames, bird cages, and even children's metal toys. Boys and girls were encouraged to turn in their toy soldiers, wagons, and tricycles. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts played a huge role, going door to door with carts and wagons to collect the scrap. Schools organized their own collection drives, with classes competing to see who could bring in the most. It was a way to get even the youngest citizens involved in the war effort. The community-level efforts were remarkable. Towns and cities donated historic cannons from their public squares. Old jails gave up their iron bars. The churches donated their bells. One of the most visible sacrifices was the removal of iron fences and railings from parks, cemeteries, and private homes. In cities like London and New York, long stretches of ornamental ironwork that had stood for generations were cut down and hauled away. This dramatically changed the appearance of these urban landscapes. It was a stark visual reminder that this was a total war, and nothing was sacred if it could be used for the cause. The collected scrap was piled high in town squares and schoolyards before being loaded onto trains and sent to the steel mills. There it was melted down in massive furnaces and mixed with new iron ore to produce steel. This steel was then used to build tanks, ships, guns, and ammunition. The press followed the journey of the scrap. A reporter might write a story about a specific pile of scrap from a small town in Iowa, tracking it to a steel mill in Pittsburgh, and then to a shipyard in California, where it became part of a new Liberty ship. This created a powerful narrative that connected individual acts of donation to the grand scale of the war. The 1942 scrap drive was a huge success, collecting millions of tons of metal. But as with other drives, its importance was not just in the material it provided. It was a massive exercise in public mobilization and morale. It brought communities together. It gave people a sense of direct participation. By giving up something tangible, a piece of their property, they felt a personal stake in the outcome of the war. The campaign was overseen by the Conservation Division of the War Production Board, which used every tool of modern advertising and propaganda to encourage participation. And posters with slogans like "Get in the scrap" and "Junkin' for victory" were everywhere. But the full history of the scrap drives is complex. how much of the collected metal was actually high-grade steel suitable for military production. Some of the donated items, like cast iron railings, were not ideal for making high-quality steel. Historians like Stewart, T.S. Ross, have argued that the propaganda value of these collections often outweighed their material contribution, as the bulk of scrap steel continued to come from industrial sources like railroads and auto wreckers. We don't have a clear accounting of how much scrap was collected but never used, left to rust in collection piles due to logistical problems. What was the true economic cost of collecting, sorting, and transporting millions of tons of low-grade household scrap compared to its actual value to the steel industry? And what long-term impact did the removal of historic ironwork have on the cultural heritage of the cities that sacrificed it? Number 13, could a can of beans become a soldier's radio? The humble tin can was a staple in every home. It was also a vital resource for the war. But the name tin can is a bit misleading. The can itself is mostly made of steel. It's just coated with a very thin layer of tin. Both of these metals were in high demand. Steel was the primary material for almost all military hardware. Tin was a strategic material, crucial for a variety of applications. It was used as a solder to connect electrical components in radios, radar systems, and other electronics. It was used in engine bearings, and it was used as a coating to prevent corrosion, which was essential for food containers sent to troops overseas. The problem was that, like rubber, the world's main sources of tin were in Southeast Asia, and those supplies were now cut off. This made every existing tin can a miniature mine of valuable metal. The government launched a massive campaign to get people to recycle their cans. The process was more involved than just throwing them in a bin. Citizens were instructed to wash the cans thoroughly, remove both ends, and then flatten them. This wash, open, flatten routine was drilled into the public through posters, radio ads, and newspaper articles. The flattened cans took up less space, making them easier to transport. Collection points were set up in neighborhoods, often at grocery stores or fire stations. In many communities, sanitation workers would separate the cans from the rest of the garbage if they hadn't been put out separately. The collected cans were then sent to special detinning plants. There, they were put through a chemical process that stripped the thin layer of tin from the steel. The recovered tin was then reused for its critical military applications. The remaining steel was baled up and sent to steel mills to be recycled into new steel. The scale of this effort was enormous. The War Production Board estimated that the cans from an average American city could provide enough tin to solder the electrical connections on hundreds of fighter planes. The propaganda played heavily on this. A poster might show a line of tin cans transforming into a line of tanks. The message was that by simply recycling their food cans, housewives were directly contributing to the production of weapons. The campaign was relentless. In some areas, there were even can wardens, volunteers who would check to make sure their neighbors were properly preparing their cans for collection. The effort was not without its challenges. The detinning process was complex and required specific facilities. Not all parts of the country had easy access to these plants, creating logistical hurdles. There was also the issue of contamination. If the cans weren't washed properly, the food residue could interfere with the detinning process. Despite these issues, millions of tons of cans were collected and recycled over the course of the war. This effort significantly supplemented the nation's supply of tin and steel, helping to keep the war factories running at full capacity. But what parts of the story are still untold? We lack precise data on the efficiency of the detinning process during the war. How much of the tin was successfully recovered, and how much was lost? What was the true energy cost of collecting, transporting, and processing all these cans compared to using primary sources of metal? There are also social questions that remain. How much social pressure was exerted on people to comply with the can recycling rules? Were there penalties for not participating, and how did the can recycling program influence the development of post-war recycling and waste management systems? Did it lay the groundwork for the modern recycling movement, or was it seen as a temporary emergency measure that was quickly forgotten once the war was over? Number 12, did squeezing your toothpaste tube help build a submarine? It's one of the more unusual recycling stories of the war. People were asked to save their empty toothpaste and shaving cream tubes. Today, these tubes are made of plastic or aluminum, but in the 1940s, they were made of collapsible metal, primarily tin and lead. These metals, especially tin, were in critically short supply. As we saw with tin cans, tin was essential for solder, which was the glue that held together the electronics of the war. Lead was also vital, used in batteries for submarines and vehicles, as well as in ammunition. So the government instituted a mandatory recycling program for these metal tubes. You couldn't just buy a new tube of toothpaste to get a new one. You had to turn in your old empty one. This tube for a tube policy was implemented across the country. When you went to the drugstore to buy a new tube of Apana toothpaste or Barbasol shaving cream, you had to present your empty tube to the clerk. The clerk would take the old tube and then sell you the new one. This system ensured a very high rate of return. There was no way to forget or to be lazy about it. If you wanted more toothpaste, you had to recycle. The drugstores became the front line of this collection effort. They would accumulate the empty tubes and then sell them to scrap metal dealers. From there, the tubes were sent to refineries where the tin and lead were separated and melted down to be reused. The amounts from a single tube were tiny, but when multiplied by millions of people using toothpaste and shaving cream every day, the total amount of salvaged metal was significant. The War Production Board calculated that the tin salvaged from these tubes was enough to meet a substantial portion of the demand from electronics manufacturers. This program is a fascinating example of how the war reached into the most mundane aspects of daily life. The simple act of brushing your teeth was now connected to the war effort. The government's messaging reinforced this. An advertisement might say something like, "The tin in your empty toothpaste tube can help solder the wiring in a bomber." It made the connection explicit, right? This was a form of closed-loop recycling, right, where the consumer had a direct role in returning the packaging to the supply chain. It was a remarkably efficient system born out of necessity. The tube for a tube policy was in effect for a significant portion of the war. It only ended when the supply of strategic metals began to improve and when manufacturers started to develop alternative forms of packaging. The program demonstrates the level of control the government was willing and able to exert over the civilian economy and consumer behavior. It was a microcosm of the larger command economy that was put in place to manage the nation's resources. But there are still aspects of this program that are not well documented. How did the government enforce this policy? Were there penalties for drugstores that didn't comply? We don't know much about the public's reaction. Was it seen as a reasonable sacrifice, or was it a frustrating inconvenience? We also lack detailed records on the black market. Were people creating counterfeit empty tubes to get new products? And what was the exact process used by the refineries to separate the tin and lead from the residual toothpaste and the paint on the outside of the tubes? The full story of this small but significant recycling effort is still waiting to be told. Number 11, could yesterday's newspaper wrap tomorrow's shells? Paper seems like a common, almost limitless resource, but during the war, it became a strategic commodity. The demand for paper and paper products skyrocketed. It was needed for packaging. Almost every item sent to the troops, from food to ammunition, had to be packed in paper or cardboard boxes. This required vast quantities of paperboard. Paper was also a direct component of some munitions. The casings for certain types of artillery shells were made from a special kind of compressed paper. It was also needed for maps, training manuals, and government documents. The bureaucracy of war ran on paper. With so much wood pulp being diverted to military production, there was a severe shortage of paper for civilian use. To close this gap, a massive nationwide paper salvage campaign was launched. It was one of the most sustained and widespread recycling efforts of the war. The slogan was, "Wasti paper is war paper." People were urged to save every scrap. This included old newspapers, magazines, cardboard boxes, wrapping paper, and even letters. Nothing was to be thrown away. The collection was often a community-based effort. The Boy Scouts were once again at the forefront, organizing paper drives where they would go door to door, collecting bundles of paper. In schools, churches, and civic organizations all participated. In many cities, there were competitions to see which neighborhood or group could collect the most paper. The collected paper was bundled and sent to mills, where it was pulped and reprocessed into new paper and paperboard products for the war effort. The government's propaganda machine worked overtime to promote paper recycling. Posters showed stacks of newspapers turning into V-mail, the lightweight letter sheets that soldiers used to write home. Other posters showed how a ton of waste paper could be used to make hundreds of shell casings. The message was that saving paper was not just about conserving resources, it was about directly supplying the front lines. The campaign was highly successful. In the United States alone, millions of tons of waste paper were collected each year. This made up a significant percentage of the raw material used by paper mills. The paper shortage had a visible effect on daily life. Newspapers were printed with smaller margins and fewer pages. Magazines became thinner. The government placed restrictions on non-essential uses of paper, such as advertising circulars and elaborate packaging for consumer goods. The paper salvage campaign was not just a response to a shortage, it was an integral part of the managed economy of the war. It was a way to ensure that the military's needs were met while still providing for essential civilian uses. But the history of the paper drives is not without its complexities. There were periods when the collection was too successful. So much paper was collected that it overwhelmed the transportation and processing facilities. In some cases, huge piles of salvaged paper had to be burned because there was no way to move them to the mills. This led to public frustration and confusion. We still don't have a complete picture of these logistical failures. How often did they happen, and what was the public's reaction? We also don't know the full impact of the paper drives on the publishing industry. How did they adapt to the fluctuating supply and quality of recycled paper? And what happened to the vast archives of personal letters and documents that were turned in? Were any historically significant materials lost forever in the rush to pulp them for the war? Number 10 were old shirts used to clean a battleship's guns. When a piece of clothing became too worn out to be worn or mended, it became a rag. And during the war, rags were a surprisingly important industrial resource. The massive expansion of manufacturing for the war created a huge demand for wiping cloths. In every factory that built engines, planes, or tanks, workers needed rags to wipe away grease, oil, and metal shavings from machinery and parts. A clean machine is an efficient machine, and industrial hygiene was crucial for maintaining the frantic pace of production. Cotton and wool rags were the most valuable. Cotton was absorbent and good for general cleaning. Wool rags had a special property when treated with certain chemicals. They could be used for polishing metals to a high sheen, which was important for precision parts. So the government put out a call for old clothes, curtains, sheets, and any other textile scraps. The campaign was often run alongside other salvage drives. People were told to save their rags in a separate bag and turn them in at collection depots. The collected rags were sent to sorting facilities. There, they were sorted by material type, cotton, wool, silk, etc., and quality. They were then cleaned and sterilized. The best ones were cut into standard sizes and sold to factories as wiping cloths. This was the primary use. The demand was so high that it couldn't be met by household donations alone. The government also contracted with industrial laundries and textile mills to process their scraps. But wiping cloths weren't the only use for recycled textiles. Lower grade rags and fibers could be reprocessed into other materials. Wool scraps could be shoddy, a process where the fibers are pulled apart and then respun into new yarn or pressed into felt. This shoddy wool was used to make blankets and coats for soldiers. Cotton rags could be broken down into their cellulose fibers and used to make high-quality paper. This special rag paper was used for maps and currency, as it was much more durable than paper made from wood pulp. The rag drive was another example of how the war effort sought to eliminate waste and find a use for everything. It was promoted as a way for housewives to contribute to the industrial side of the war. A poster from the British Ministry of Supply showed a woman holding up an old pair of trousers with the caption, "Even this old pair is useful." The message was that nothing should be overlooked. This was part of a broader make, do, and mend culture that was encouraged by the government to conserve resources. Instead of throwing things away, people were taught to repair, reuse, and ultimately recycle them. We still have an incomplete picture of the rag trade during the war. How large was this industry? We know it was significant, but detailed production figures are scarce. We don't know the exact proportions of rags that went to wiping cloth, shoddy, or paper production. What was the journey of a typical bundle of rags from a home to its final use? We also have little information about the working conditions in the rag sorting and processing plants, which were often dirty and labor-intensive jobs. And what happened to the new synthetic fabrics of the era, like rayon, were they also collected and recycled? And if so, what were they used for? Number 9, did reusing a jam jar help deliver medicine to a wounded soldier? Today, we make a distinction between reusing and recycling. During the war, reusing was the first and most important step, especially for things like glass jars and bottles. Glass manufacturing is an energy-intensive process, and both energy and the raw materials for glass were needed for other things. The silica sand used to make glass was also used in foundries for casting metal parts, so conserving glass was a priority. The primary message to the public was not to break or throw away glass containers. The campaign focused heavily on food jars. With canned goods being rationed and much of the metal supply going to the military, more food was being sold in glass jars. Housewives were urged to return their empty jam jars, pickle jars, and milk bottles to the store where they bought them. The stores would then send them back to the food manufacturers to be washed, sterilized, and refilled. This created a circular system that saved an enormous amount of energy and raw materials. This wasn't just a voluntary effort. In many places, a deposit system was put in place. You would pay a small extra amount for the jar, which you would get back when you returned it. This is similar to the bottle deposit systems that still exist in some places today. It provided a strong financial incentive to participate. The government also worked with manufacturers to standardize the sizes and shapes of jars and bottles. This made them easier to collect, sort, and reuse. A standard Victory jar was introduced for home canning, designed for maximum durability and reusability. When a jar or bottle was too old or broken to be reused, it was then recycled. Communities set up cullet collection points where people could bring their broken glass. This cullet was then sent to glass factories, where it was melted down with new raw materials to make new glass. Using cullet in the glass-making process lowers the melting temperature, which saves a significant amount of fuel. The recycled glass was used to make new containers for food and medicine. Medical supplies, such as plasma and penicillin, were shipped in glass bottles. So a recycled jam jar could, in a very real sense, become a bottle that delivered life-saving medicine to a soldier. The glass conservation campaign was a quiet but constant part of life on the home front. It didn't have the dramatic flair of the scrap metal drives, but it was just as important. It was about changing daily habits and instilling a mindset of conservation. Women's magazines were filled with tips on how to clean and care for jars and how to use them for home canning to preserve food from their victory gardens. The effort was a success. The reuse and recycling rates for glass containers were extremely high throughout the war. But there are still many details of this system that are lost to history. How was the nationwide system of returning and refilling jars managed? It must have been a complex logistical challenge for grocers and food companies. We don't know how much of the glass supply was maintained through reuse versus recycling of broken cullet. What were the public health challenges associated with reusing glass containers on such a massive scale? Were there concerns about contamination or improper sterilization? And finally, how did this intensive experience with reuse and deposit systems shape post-war consumer attitudes towards disposable packaging, which became so prevalent in the following decades? Number 8, how many tanks were hiding in your neighbor's old car? By the time the war started, the automobile had become a central part of American life, but the war brought civilian car production to a complete halt. In February 1942, the last new car for the civilian market rolled off the assembly line. The factories that had been making family sedans were converted to produce tanks, planes, and jeeps. This meant that the existing cars on the road had to last for the duration of the war. But it also meant that old, broken-down cars were no longer just junk. They were a massive, readily available source of scrap metal and rubber. The government organized a specific campaign to salvage these younger cars. Auto graveyards, as they were called, became a key part of the scrap metal supply chain. The War Production Board worked with the auto wrecking industry to streamline the process of dismantling these cars and salvaging every usable part. A single car could yield over a ton of steel, as well as significant amounts of other valuable materials. The tires, of course, were a source of rubber. The battery contained lead. The radiator was made of copper and brass. Even the small amounts of aluminum in the engine pistons were carefully salvaged. This was an industrial-scale recycling effort. But it also had a public component. People with old, unused cars sitting in their barns or backyards were encouraged to sell them to the scrapyards. The auto graveyard drives were heavily publicized. Newsreels would show huge cranes lifting cars and dropping them into crushers. It was a dramatic visual of the nation's industrial might being mobilized. The message was that an old car rusting in a field was a wasted resource, but a car sent to the graveyard could be reborn as a tank or a ship. The conservation of existing cars was just as important as the salvaging of old ones, because no new cars were being made and parts were scarce. Keeping your car running was a patriotic duty. The government urged people to drive less, to share rides, and to maintain their vehicles carefully. The Victory speed limit of 35 mph was intended as much to save tires and engines as it was to save gasoline. This created a culture of automotive conservation that lasted for years. The conversion of the auto industry was one of the miracles of the American war effort. A company like Ford, which had perfected the art of mass-producing cars, turned its expertise to building B-24 bombers at its Willow Run plant. The skills of the auto workers, from machinists to assembly line workers, were directly transferable to war production. The auto graveyards were the flip side of this story. They were the source of the raw materials that fed these converted factories. But the history of the auto salvage program is not fully documented. We don't have precise figures on how many of the millions of tons of scrap steel came specifically from salvaged automobiles versus other sources like railroads or demolished buildings. What was the economic impact on the auto wrecking industry, which was suddenly transformed into a key part of the war economy? We also don't know the full story of how car parts were reused. With no new parts being made, there must have been a thriving business in salvaging and reconditioning parts from wrecked cars to keep the nation's essential vehicles running. How was the second-hand parts market organized and regulated? Number 7. Was an old plow more valuable in a field or in a furnace? The war was fought on farms as much as on battlefields. Feeding the nation and its allies was a strategic priority. This created a huge demand for new farm machinery. Tractors, plows, and combines were needed to increase food production, especially with so many farm laborers now serving in the military. But the factories that made this equipment also needed steel, the same steel that was needed for tanks and guns. This created a dilemma how to balance the need for steel for weapons with the need for steel for food production. One part of the solution was to salvage old, unused farm equipment. Across the country, farms were littered with old machinery that had been replaced by newer models. There were horse-drawn plows rusting in fence rows, old tractors that no longer ran, and broken down pieces of equipment of every description. The Department of Agriculture, working with the War Production Board, launched a campaign to get this scrap metal off the farms and into the steel mills. This was a different kind of scrap drive. It was targeted at the rural population. County agents and local chapters of organizations like the 4-H Club and the Future Farmers of America were mobilized to organize the collection. They would go from farm to farm, identifying unused equipment and arranging for it to be hauled away. In many cases, the farmers themselves would use their tractors and wagons to bring the old machinery to a central collection point in the nearest town. The amount of metal available on farms was immense. A single old tractor could provide a ton or more of high-quality scrap iron and steel. The campaign was a success, bringing in hundreds of thousands of tons of metal. This scrap was particularly valuable because it was often heavy and of good quality. It was a vital supplement to the scrap being collected in the cities. The program was promoted with slogans like "plowshares into swords," a reversal of the famous biblical phrase. It was a powerful message that resonated with the farming community. This campaign also highlights the rapid technological change that was happening in American agriculture. The drive to collect old horse-drawn equipment was, in a way, clearing out the remnants of a past era of farming. The war accelerated the mechanization of agriculture as the demand for food and the shortage of labor made tractors and other machinery more essential than ever. The scrap drive was part of this transition, turning the tools of the old way of farming into the raw materials for the new industrial war. But there are still many unanswered questions about the farm scrap program. How did the government decide which equipment was truly scrap and which might still be needed for food production? There must have been conflicts and difficult decisions made on individual farms, We don't have good data on how much of the collected machinery was actually processed versus how much may have been left in collection piles. We also don't know the full story of the black market for farm equipment. With new machinery so scarce, was there a thriving trade in stolen or illicitly sold old equipment? And how did the removal of this old machinery change the physical and cultural landscape of rural America in the long term? Number 6, could the key to your old house unlock a victory? Sometimes the smallest things can make a contribution. During the war, people were even asked to turn in their old keys. It seems like a minor thing, but it was part of the all-encompassing nature of the scrap drives. Every little bit counted. Keys were typically made of brass or nickel-plated steel. Both of these were valuable metals for the war effort. Brass, an alloy of copper and zinc, was the primary material for ammunition casings. Millions upon millions of shell and bullet casings were needed, and each one started as a small piece of brass. Nickel was an important alloying element for steel, used to make armor plate and other high-strength components. So collection boxes for old keys appeared in public places like post offices, libraries, and stores. People were encouraged to rummage through their drawers and get rid of any keys they no longer needed, keys to old houses, old cars, old padlocks, or luggage. It was a simple, easy way for anyone to contribute. It didn't require much effort or sacrifice. Most people have a small collection of mystery keys, and this was a chance to put them to good use. The key collection drives were often more symbolic than anything else. The total amount of metal collected from keys was tiny compared to the amount from junk cars or industrial scrap. But the symbolism was powerful. A key is a personal item. It represents access, security, and home. Giving up an old key was like giving up a small piece of your personal history. The campaigns often played on this symbolism. A poster might show a pile of keys with the slogan, "Unlock victory with your old keys." This was part of a broader strategy to collect non-ferrous metals, which are metals that don't contain iron, like copper, brass, zinc, and nickel. These metals were often scarcer and more critical for specific applications than steel. The key drives were a way to tap into the small household supply of these valuable materials. They were often run alongside collections for other small metal items like old faucets, plumbing fixtures, and decorative brass objects. The key drives are a good example of how the scrap campaigns were designed to engage everyone in the war effort, regardless of their ability to make large contributions. A child could contribute a single old key and feel like they were doing their part, just like a farmer who donated an entire tractor. It was about creating a sense of universal participation and shared purpose. But because they were a relatively small part of the overall scrap effort, the history of the key drives is not well documented. We have no reliable figures on how many tons of keys were actually collected. We don't know what the process was for sorting the keys by metal type. Were they manually sorted, or was there a more industrial process? What was the actual yield of valuable brass and nickel from these drives after accounting for the costs of collection and processing? And what are the stories behind the keys that were turned in? How many of them were keepsakes or mementos that people sacrificed for the cause? Number 5, did your favorite song get melted down for a radio insulator? Before vinyl became the standard, phonograph records were made of a different material, shellac. Shellac is a natural resin produced by an insect called the lac bug, which is found in India and Thailand. It was used to make the thick, brittle 78 RPM records that were common at the time. When the war began, shellac suddenly became a strategic material. The supply lines from Asia were disrupted, making it scarce, and it had important military uses. Shellac was an excellent electrical insulator and was used in the manufacturing of radio equipment, insulators, and other electronic components. It was also used as a component in certain types of varnish and adhesive. This created a shortage for the record industry, but it also created an opportunity for recycling. The public was asked to turn in their old unwanted records. The Scrap for Shellac drives were launched. People could take their old records by artists like Glenn Miller or Bing Crosby to collection centers. The idea was that the music of yesterday could become the military hardware of today. The collected records were crushed and the shellac was reclaimed. It was a difficult process as the records also contained fillers like slate powder and cotton fibers. But the reclaimed shellac was a valuable resource that could be funneled directly into war production. The record companies themselves were heavily involved in these drives. They had a vested interest in promoting them, as the reclaimed shellac could be used to press new records, keeping them in business during the shortage. The shellac shortage had a profound impact on the music industry. Record production was curtailed. Companies had to be selective about what they released. It also spurred innovation. The search for a replacement for shellac led to increased research into synthetic plastics. This eventually led to the development of the vinyl record, which was more durable and had better sound quality. During the war, a special type of record called a V-disc, Victory disc, was produced for soldiers. These were made of a vinyl-based compound, partly because of the shellac shortage. They were not sold to the public and were a key part of the effort to maintain troop morale. The record recycling campaign is a fascinating intersection of culture and war. It shows how a popular form of entertainment was directly impacted by global conflict and how its physical form became a resource. The idea of a Benny Goodman record being melted down to help build a military radio is a striking image of the total nature of the war effort. But there are many unanswered questions about this chapter of recycling history. How much of the military's demand for shellac was met by these recycling drives versus existing stockpiles or alternative materials? What was the efficiency of the shellac reclamation process? We don't have good records on which records were turned in the most. Were certain genres or artists sacrificed more than others? And what was the cultural impact of this? Did the shortage of new records lead people to listen to the radio more? And did this change the landscape of popular music in the post-war era? Number 4, were books sacrificed for paper or for souls? This is one of the most complex recycling stories of the war because it involved a direct conflict of values. On one hand, books are made of paper, and paper was a critical rationed commodity. The paper salvage drives, as we've seen, urged people to turn in all their old paper, and books were no exception. In this context, a book was just a bundle of potential pulp ready to be turned into packaging or shell casings. Many thousands of old books were donated to the paper drives and met this fate. But on the other hand, books were also seen as a vital tool for maintaining morale, both at home and among the troops. The soldiers in camps, on ships, and in hospitals faced long periods of boredom and anxiety. Books were a source of entertainment, education, and escape. They were a connection to the world of ideas and culture that they were fighting to defend. This led to a completely different kind of drive, the Victory Book Campaign. The Victory Book Campaign was a massive effort launched in 1942 by a coalition of organizations, including the American Library Association and the Red Cross. The goal was to collect books to be sent to soldiers. The slogan was, "Any book you want to keep is a good book to give." People were urged to go through their personal libraries and donate books that were in good condition. The collection bins were set up in libraries, schools, and other public places. The response was enormous. In its first year, the campaign collected over 10 million books. Volunteers sorted through the donations, weeding out books that were in poor condition or had unsuitable content. The acceptable books were then packed up and shipped to military bases and USO centers around the world. These books became the foundation of a vast library system for the armed forces. They were a lifeline for many soldiers, providing a much-needed mental and emotional outlet. So, for the Humble Book, there were two competing wartime destinies. It could be pulped for its raw material, or it could be preserved for its intellectual and emotional content. This created a tension that played out in communities across the country. Sometimes, the paper salvage drives and the book donation campaigns were in direct competition. A local library might be trying to collect books for soldiers, while the local Boy Scout troop was trying to collect them for the paper mill. This dual nature of the book drives reveals a lot about the culture of the time. It shows that even in a total war, where every material resource was precious, there was still a deep understanding of the importance of culture, ideas, and the human spirit. The decision of what to do with an old book was not just a practical one, it was a moral and cultural one. There are still many unanswered questions about these dueling campaigns. How did individuals and communities decide which books to pulp and which to send to soldiers? Were there guidelines issued by the government? We don't have a clear accounting of how many books were destroyed for paper versus how many were sent to the troops. What types of books were most commonly donated to the Victory Book Campaign? A detailed analysis of the surviving records could give us a fascinating snapshot of the reading tastes of the era. And what was the long-term impact of this massive redistribution of books? Did it help to foster a generation of readers among the returning soldiers? Number 3, did a kitchen pot really become a fighter plane? One of the earliest and most famous recycling drives was the Pots and Pans for Planes campaign. It was based on a simple, appealing idea. Aluminum from household items could be used to build military aircraft. Aluminum is a lightweight yet strong metal, making it ideal for aviation. In 1941, even before the United States officially entered the war, a national campaign was launched to collect scrap aluminum. The public was asked to donate any and all aluminum items. They had pots, pans, kitchen utensils, ice cube trays, and even decorative items. The campaign was a huge public relations success. It was one of the first major home front efforts, and it captured the public's imagination. Newsreels and photographs showed mountains of aluminum pots and pans piling up in town squares. President Roosevelt praised the effort, and celebrities like Rita Hayworth were photographed donating their own cookware. It was a tangible way for people, especially women, to feel like they were contributing directly to the nation's defense. The idea that your old frying pan could become part of a Spitfire or a B-17 bomber was incredibly motivating. The drives collected a massive amount of aluminum, estimated to be in the tens of millions of pounds. It was a powerful demonstration of public support for the war effort. However, the actual military value of this household aluminum has been a subject of historical debate. The aluminum used in aircraft construction needs to be of a very specific high-purity alloy. The aluminum from pots and pans was often mixed with other metals and was of varying quality. Separating and reprocessing this scrap into aircraft grade, aluminum was a difficult and expensive process. In reality, the American aluminum industry was already ramping up production on a massive scale. New smelters were being built, and the industry was able to produce vast quantities of high-grade aluminum from bauxite ore. Many historians, including those at the National WE Museum, now argue that the household scrap aluminum contributed very little, if anything, to actual aircraft production. Most of it was likely used for less critical applications like making castings for engine parts or other equipment. So, if the material contribution was minimal, why was the campaign so heavily promoted? The answer lies in its value as propaganda. The Pots and Pans drive was incredibly effective at mobilizing the public and raising awareness about the need for industrial production. It was a trial run for the much larger scrap drives that would follow for materials like steel and rubber. It taught the government valuable lessons about how to organize and promote these campaigns. It also had a powerful psychological effect, making millions of people feel personally invested in the war effort long before the country was officially at war. So what do we still not know for sure? We lack a definitive documented trail for the aluminum collected in these drives. Was any of it ever actually used in the airframe of a military plane? If not, where exactly did it all go? We also don't have a clear picture of the economic side of the campaign. What was the true cost of collecting and attempting to process this scrap? And how did it compare to the cost of producing new aluminum? And what was the long-term effect on the cookware industry? How did they cope with this sudden massive removal of their products from the nation's kitchens? Number 2, could your bathroom faucet end up in a bullet? While steel and aluminum were the stars of the scrap drives, other metals like lead and brass were just as crucial, though less publicized. These metals were essential for ammunition and electrical systems, the nervous system and fists of the military. Lead was a key component in batteries. Every truck, tank, and submarine had a large lead-acid battery to start its engine and power its systems. Lead was also used in the manufacturing of bullets. Brass, the alloy of copper and zinc, was the preferred material for making cartridge casings for bullets and artillery shells. It was strong enough to contain the explosion, but soft enough not to damage the barrel of the gun. The demand for these metals was enormous, and supplies were tight. This led to campaigns to salvage them from homes and buildings. People were asked to turn in old lead pipes, plumbing fixtures, and car batteries. Old brass items were also in demand: faucets, doorknobs, decorative items, and even musical instruments. These were not the high-profile campaigns of the major scrap drives, but they were a steady, ongoing effort. The collection was often handled by professional scrap dealers who had the expertise to identify and separate these different metals. The government worked with these dealers to ensure that the salvaged materials were channeled into war production. Plumbers and construction workers were also on the front lines of this effort. When they repaired or demolished a building, they were instructed to carefully save all the lead and brass pipes and fixtures for recycling. This was a less glamorous form of recycling. There were no big parades for collecting old faucets, but it was vital. The brass from a single old trumpet could be turned into casings for hundreds of bullets. The lead from an old plumbing system could provide the raw material for batteries for a whole platoon of Jeeps. This was the unseen industrial side of the recycling effort, turning the guts of old buildings into the components of war. The recycling of these metals also had a direct impact on civilian life. New plumbing and electrical systems used less brass and copper. Lead was replaced by other materials in paints and other consumer goods. The war forced an innovation in material science as industries searched for substitutes for these scarce metals. This had lasting effects on the way things were built in the post-war era, but there are significant gaps in our understanding of this part of the war effort. We have very little data on the total tonnage of lead and brass that was collected from civilian sources compared to industrial scrap. How effective were the public campaigns for these materials compared to the more systematic collection from demolition sites? We also don't know much about the health and environmental consequences of handling and processing these metals, especially lead, which is highly toxic. What were the working conditions like for the people who salvaged and melted down these materials? And how did the sudden demand for scrap brass and lead affect the price and availability of these metals for essential civilian uses, like repairs to existing homes and infrastructure? Number one was sacrificing a city's beauty or real or a symbolic act. Perhaps no act of recycling was more visible or more controversial than the removal of public railings and fences. In cities across Britain and, to a lesser extent, the United States, ornamental iron fences were torn down from parks, squares, and private homes. The most famous example was in London, where the railings around many of the city's iconic parks and gardens were cut away. The justification was simple. These railings were a massive untapped source of scrap iron and steel that could be melted down to make weapons. The campaign was presented as a profound act of public sacrifice. These railings were often beautiful, historic pieces of craftsmanship. They were a part of the city's identity. Removing them was a dramatic and painful alteration of the urban landscape. The government propaganda argued that this was a necessary sacrifice. A poster might show a tank rolling over a pile of broken railings with the caption, "From park railings to battle tanks." The message was that the safety of the nation was more important than its aesthetic beauty. The physical process of removing the railings was a huge undertaking. Crews of workers used cutting torches to slice through the iron posts. The railings were then carted away to scrap yards. The stumps of the railings were often left in the stone or concrete bases, and you can still see these scars in some London parks today. The campaign was a powerful symbol of total war. It showed that nothing was exempt. The very fabric of the city was being mobilized for the fight. However, the true value of this sacrifice has been seriously questioned by historians. The railings were mostly made of cast iron, not high-quality steel. Cast iron is brittle and has a high carbon content, which makes it unsuitable for producing the kind of steel needed for armor plate or gun barrels. While it could be melted down and used for some purposes like making grenades or engine blocks, it was not the high-grade scrap that the steel mills most needed. Many historians now believe that the railing campaigns were primarily for propaganda. The material contribution was secondary to the psychological impact. The sight of the railings coming down was a daily, unavoidable reminder of the war's demands. It was a way to foster a sense of shared sacrifice and to make people feel that they were all in it together. It was also a way for the government to be seen as taking decisive action. There is evidence that many of the piles of collected railings sat in scrapyards for years, and some may have never even been melted down. Some were even reportedly dumped at sea after the war. This leaves us with a haunting question. Was this dramatic transformation of cities, this sacrifice of public art and history, based on a genuine military need or on a calculated piece of political theater? We still don't have a definitive answer. There are no complete records tracking the journey of the iron from the parks to the factories. How much was actually used, and for what? What was the true reaction of the public at the time? While the official narrative was one of patriotic sacrifice, there must have been private grief and anger at the destruction of familiar landmarks. And perhaps the most poignant question, if the railings were removed primarily for show, what does that say about the relationship between a government and its people in a time of national crisis?